winter pine and crushed midnight roses. The scent hit King Nicholas like a physical blow before the cathedral doors even fully opened. It was a scent buried 5 years ago in a blood-soaked grave. His lost mate was alive, and she was standing just meters away at the altar. But the truly devastating twist wasn't that she had survived. It was the man whose hand she held. The year was 1244, and the great Cathedral of Oakhaven was suffocating beneath the weight of political pretense and heavy incense. King Nicholas of the Iron Fang pack stood near the grand altar, his posture rigid, his expression an impenetrable mask of cold indifference. He was the Alpha King, the most feared ruler across the Western territories, a man whose ruthlessness had only magnified since the light of his life was snuffed out half a decade ago. I was here merely as a formality. Duke Geoffrey of Cornwall was marrying Lady Isabella of Lancaster, a strategic union meant to bridge the fragile peace between the human nobility and the werewolf territories. The pews were packed with high-born lords and ladies. Baron Frederick sweating in his velvet doublet, Countess Margaret waving a painted fan to mask the scent of nervous perspiration. Nicholas despised these gatherings. The mingled odors of cheap perfumes, roasted meats from the courtyards, and the underlying stench of human fear grated against his heightened senses. For 5 years, Nicholas had lived as a hollow vessel. Ever since the massacre at Weeping Waters, where his mate, Eleanor, had been swept away in the blood-stained rapids after a feral pack ambush. They had never found her body. They had only found her torn cloak on the riverbank. His wolf had howled until his vocal cords tore, and then a chilling silence had taken over. He had ruled with an iron fist ever since, executing traitors, expanding his borders, and turning his heart into a fortress of ice. The Archbishop of Oakhaven raised his golden staff, his voice droning on in Latin, echoing off the towering vaulted ceilings and the intricate stained glass windows. Nicholas stared straight ahead, his ice-blue eyes unblinking. Then the heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral groaned open, letting in a gust of biting winter wind. It cut through the suffocating incense like a sharpened blade. Nicholas's breath hitched in his throat. His chest seized, a sudden violent spasm that nearly brought him to his knees. His wolf, dormant and grieving in the darkest corners of his mind, for 5 long years, violently slammed against the confines of his soul. Winter pine, crushed midnight roses, a hint of fresh rain. It was impossible. The scent was a ghost, a cruel phantom conjured by a broken mind. Nicholas closed his eyes, his gloved hands gripping the hilt of his broadsword so tightly the leather creaked. He expected the scent to fade, to be swallowed by the myrrh and frankincense. But it didn't fade. It grew stronger. It was fresh. It was real. Nicholas's eyes snapped open, and the icy blue of his irises had bled into a blinding, feral gold. A low, guttural growl vibrated in his chest, so deep and menacing that the nobles standing closest to him flinched, taking hurried steps backward. Duke Geoffrey paused his vows, looking over at the Alpha King in sheer terror. "My king?" whispered Lord William, Nicholas's current beta, stepping forward with caution. "Is it an attack?" Nicholas didn't answer. He couldn't. The rational part of his brain had completely shut down, overridden by the primal possessive instinct of an alpha who had just caught the scent of his missing soul. He moved. He didn't excuse himself. He simply marched down the velvet-lined center aisle, his heavy steel-toed boots echoing like war drums against the stone floor. The archbishop stuttered to a halt. The choir stopped singing. A heavy, terrified silence fell over the grand cathedral as the Alpha King stalked through the crowd. "Out of my way," Nicholas snarled, his voice a demonic register that sent shivers down the spines of the heavily armored knights guarding the doors. Nobles scrambled to part for him, knocking over wooden chairs and trampling each other's expensive silk trains in their haste to avoid his wrath. He followed the invisible ribbon of scent, his nostrils flaring, his heart hammering against his ribs with enough force to crack bone. The trail led him past the rear pews, weaving through the shadows of the stone pillars, toward the dark, recessed alcoves near the cathedral's exit. Someone was trying to leave. He could hear the hurried rustle of a heavy wool cloak, the soft, panicked scuff of leather slippers against the stone. "Stop," Nicholas commanded, the alpha aura radiating from his body so intensely that several human servants in the vicinity were forced to their knees, gasping for air. A figure in a deep crimson cloak froze just inches from the heavy iron handles of the side door. Nicholas closed the distance in 3 massive strides. His hand shot out, his claws slightly elongated, and he grabbed the cloaked figure by the shoulder, spinning them around with desperate, trembling force. The heavy hood fell back. Time stopped. The world, the wedding, the kingdom. It all vanished into absolute nothingness. It was her. Eleanor. She was older, the soft curves of her youth sharpened into the striking, hollowed beauty of a woman who had seen too much. A thin, jagged scar cut across her left cheekbone. A souvenir from the river that had supposedly claimed her life. Her long, raven hair was tied back hastily, and her emerald green eyes were wide, filled not with the profound, overwhelming love he remembered, but with stark, unadulterated terror. "Eleanor," Nicholas choked out, his voice cracking, breaking under the weight of 1,000 days of mourning. He reached up, his large, scarred hand trembling violently as his fingers brushed her warm, living cheek. You're alive. The river. Goddess. You're alive." He moved to pull her into his chest, to bury his face in her neck and breathe in the scent he had dreamed of every night for 5 years. But Eleanor didn't melt into his embrace. She recoiled. She threw her hands up, pressing against his armored chest, shoving him away with desperate strength. "Don't touch me," she hissed, her voice a terrified whisper that echoed like a cannon blast in Nicholas's ears. Nicholas froze, his arms suspended in the air. The rejection was a physical blow, sharper than any silver blade. "Jen, it's me. It's Nicholas. You're safe now. I have you." "I know exactly who you are," she whispered, her emerald eyes welling with tears, darting frantically toward the door. "Please, Nicholas, if you ever loved me, let me walk out that door. Let me go." "Let you go?" Nicholas repeated, his brain failing to process the words. "I spent 5 years digging through the mud of the weeping waters with my bare hands, looking for your bones. I burned down 3 rival packs, thinking they took you. And you ask me to let you go? I am your mate. I am your king." Before he could take another step toward her, a hand shot out from the shadows of the alcove. A hand clad in familiar dark leather armor, and shoved Nicholas squarely in the chest. She said, "Don't touch her, Your Grace." Nicholas stumbled back half a step, not from the physical force, but from the shock of the voice. stepping out of the darkness, placing himself protectively between the Alpha King and his lost queen, was a man Nicholas had mourned almost as deeply as Eleanor herself. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a shock of unruly auburn hair and a scar running through his left eyebrow. Caspian. Caspian, his childhood best friend. Caspian, his former beta. The man who had supposedly died in the same ambush, fighting off a dozen feral wolves to buy Eleanor time to run. The man whose empty coffin sat in the royal crypt, draped in the king's own colours. Caspian, Nicholas breathed, his mind fracturing into a million jagged pieces. He looked from Caspian to Eleanor, and then down at their hands. Caspian's fingers were tightly interlaced with Eleanor's. A dark, violent crimson haze began to creep into the edges of Nicholas's vision. The devastating sorrow of the past 5 years instantly transmuted into a raging, volcanic fury. The betrayal tasted like ash and copper in his mouth. "You," Nicholas growled, the sound vibrating the stained glass above them. "You took her. You faked your death, and you stole my mate." "I didn't steal her, Nicholas," Caspian said, his voice remarkably steady, despite the murderous intent rolling off the king in waves. Caspian subtly shifted his stance, dropping his center of gravity, preparing for an attack he knew he couldn't win. "I saved her. From you." "From me?" Nicholas roared, unable to contain the beast any longer. He lunged forward, gripping Caspian by the throat of his armor, and slamming him against the heavy oak door. The wood splintered under the impact. Caspian choked, his hands coming up to grip Nicholas's wrists, but the Alpha King's strength was insurmountable. "Nicholas, stop!" Eleanor screamed, throwing herself at his back, her fists pounding against his broad shoulders. "Let him go! You'll kill him!" "That is exactly what I am going to do," Nicholas snarled, his fangs fully descended, pressing against Caspian's windpipe. "Treason! Kidnapping a royal! Defiling the king's mate! I will mount his head on a spike at the gates of the citadel." "I didn't kidnap me," Eleanor shrieked, her voice echoing through the silent, terrified cathedral. The nobles in the pews were watching in horrified fascination, trapped in the presence of apex predators at war. "I asked him to take me. I begged him to hide me from you." Nicholas froze again. The absolute conviction in her voice forced his grip to loosen just a fraction. Caspian gasped for air, sliding an inch down the splintered wood. Nicholas turned his head slowly, his glowing gold eyes locking onto his mate. "You begged him to hide from me? Why? We were happy. We were going to rule together." "We were happy until I found the letters, Nicholas," Eleanor said, her voice shaking, tears finally spilling over her scarred cheek. "The letters bearing your royal seal, the orders to the feral packs. You orchestrated the ambush at Weeping Waters. You ordered them to slaughter my family's guard, and you ordered them to make sure I never returned to the capital." The words hung in the cold air, thick and poisonous. Nicholas stared at her, utterly bewildered. "What are you talking about? I ordered no such thing. I loved you. I would have burned the world down to keep you safe." "Don't lie to me," she cried, stepping back, pulling her cloak tighter around herself. "I saw the parchment. I saw your signature. You needed an excuse to go to war with the Riverlands, and you needed a martyr to rally the packs. You used me. When the ambush happened, Caspian found me in the river. He pulled me out. He showed me the orders he intercepted from your messenger. He abandoned his rank, his home, his life, everything, just to keep me alive. We've been running from your assassins ever since. Nicholas looked back at Caspian, who was still pinned against the door, breathing heavily, but staring back at Nicholas with a defiant, burning hatred. You showed her forged letters? Nicholas's voice dropped to a lethal, quiet whisper. You fabricated an assassination plot, framed me, and convinced my mate to run away with you. They weren't forged, Caspian spat, coughing. I saw the seal, Nicholas. I knew you were growing power-hungry, but I never thought you'd sacrifice her. I did what I had to do to protect the Queen. Nicholas's mind raced. Forgeries, a setup. Someone within his own court, someone with access to his royal seal, had orchestrated the ambush and manipulated Caspian into believing Nicholas was the monster. And Caspian, playing the noble knight, had stolen Eleanor away into the shadows. 5 years of hell. 5 years of a dead heart, all because of a lie. I never wrote those letters, Nicholas said, his voice cracking with a terrifying vulnerability. He released Caspian, stepping back, his hands raised in surrender. Eleanor, look at me. Look into my eyes. A mate bond does not lie. Search my soul right now and tell me you see a murderer. Eleanor hesitated. She looked up into his eyes, the feral gold fading back into that familiar, haunting ice blue. For a fractured second, the invisible tether between them, the ancient, unbreakable magic of the mate bond, sparked to life. Nicholas felt a rush of her emotions, the crushing fear, the deep-seated exhaustion of living on the run, and beneath it all, a buried, agonizing love that she had tried desperately to kill. She took a breath, her resolve wavering. Nicholas, Mama. The small, fragile voice came from the darkest corner of the alcove, hidden behind a large stone baptismal font. Nicholas's heart stopped completely. A tiny figure stepped out from the shadows. He couldn't have been more than 4 years old. He was clutching a small wooden toy sword in one hand, rubbing his sleepy eyes with the other. He wore a simple peasant's tunic, far too thin for the winter draft. But it wasn't the clothes that made Nicholas's blood run cold. It was the boy's face. He had Eleanor's dark raven hair, falling in soft curls around his forehead. But his eyes... The boy looked up, terrified by the yelling, and locked eyes with the Alpha King. They were ice blue, the exact, unmistakable, piercing silver blue of the Iron Fang royal bloodline. Nicholas's eyes. Mama, why is the scary man yelling at Papa Caspian? The little boy whimpered, running across the stone floor and hiding behind Eleanor's skirts, burying his face in her leg. Papa Caspian. The words hit Nicholas like a war hammer to the chest. The air was sucked from his lungs. He looked at the boy, then at Eleanor, whose face had drained of all color, her hands shaking violently as she shielded the child from Nicholas's gaze. A child, Nicholas whispered, the words barely making it past his lips. He calculated the years. 5 years since the ambush. A 4-year-old boy. He is... I is mine, Caspian interrupted, pushing himself off the door, stepping in front of Eleanor and the boy, shielding them with his own body. His name is Leo, and he is my son. Nicholas looked at his former best friend, his beta, the man who had supposedly died for him. Then he looked down at the boy peering around Caspian's leg, the boy with the Iron Fang eyes, the royal eyes that only appeared in the true bloodline of the king. You lie, Nicholas said, his voice eerily calm, the calm of a hurricane's eye before absolute destruction. That boy has the eyes of the kings of Oakhaven. He was conceived before the ambush, before you stole my wife." Eleanor closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "Nicholas, please." "I is my son," Nicholas said, the realization crashing over him, tearing through the 5 years of numbness, replacing it with a staggering, overwhelming agony. "You took my mate. You stole my son, and you raised him to call you father." The silence in the cathedral was absolute. The entire nobility of the Western Territories held their breath, watching a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions unfold in the shadows of the wedding altar. Nicholas drew his broadsword. The agonizing screech of steel, sliding from its scabbard, echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "You have 5 seconds to draw your weapon, Caspian," the Alpha King commanded, his eyes glowing gold once more, his fangs fully exposed. "Because I am going to take my family back, and I am going to leave your head on this altar." The screech of the Alpha King's broadsword against its scabbard was a death knell that froze the blood of every lord and lady in the Oakhaven Cathedral. Nicholas's massive chest heaved, his aura so violently oppressive that the stained glass windows rattled in their lead casings. Caspian did not flinch. He reached beneath his heavy leather cloak and drew a battered, curved hunting knife. It was a pathetic defense against a king who had cleaved men in 2 with a single swing. But Caspian planted his boots firmly on the stone, his auburn hair falling over his scarred eyebrow. He was ready to die for a child that wasn't his blood, and a woman who belonged to another. "I will not let you touch them," Caspian growled, his own wolf rising, though it was instantly dwarfed by the sheer magnitude of the Alpha King's presence. Nicholas raised his sword, the polished steel catching the candlelight. The heartbreak in his chest had crystallized into pure, unadulterated executioner's rage. He swung, but the blade never connected. Eleanor threw herself violently between the 2 men, wrapping her arms around Caspian's neck and burying her face in his chest, putting her fragile back directly in the path of Nicholas's descending blade. "No!" she screamed, the sound tearing through the cathedral like tearing silk. Nicholas's muscles locked. The broadsword halted mere millimeters from the crimson wool of her cloak, the sudden exertion of stopping the heavy weapon, tearing a muscle in Nicholas's shoulder. He stood there, panting, his gold eyes wide with horror as he stared at his mate, his beautiful, lost Eleanor, willing to die to protect the man who had stolen her. "Move, Eleanor," Nicholas commanded, his voice trembling violently. "Kill me," she sobbed, turning her head to look at him, her emerald eyes blazing with a defiant, broken fire. "If you are the monster those letters proved you to be, then finish what you started at the Weeping Waters. Strike me down, Nicholas, but you will not touch him, and you will never touch my son." Nicholas lowered the sword slowly, the tip clattering against the stone floor. The fight drained out of him, replaced by a suffocating, crushing despair. He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused from years of ruthless warfare, and realized she truly believed it. She looked at him and saw a butcher. Before Nicholas could speak, a sharp, mechanical thwack echoed from the opposite side of the cathedral. A steel-tipped crossbow bolt tore through the air, whistling perfectly between the stone pillars. It wasn't aimed at Nicholas. It wasn't aimed at Caspian. It was aimed directly at the 4-year-old boy cowering behind Eleanor's skirts. Nicholas's supernatural reflexes took over before his conscious mind even registered the threat. He lunged, his large hand snapping out, the thick leather of his gauntlet catching the iron bolt mere inches from Leo's face. The kinetic force of the arrow tore the skin of his palm, blood dripping instantly onto the cathedral floor. Complete chaos erupted. Women screamed, lords scrambled for the exits, and knights drew their swords, unsure of who the enemy was. Nicholas ripped the bolt from his hand and spun toward the trajectory of the shot. Standing near the altar, a second crossbow already in his hands, was Lord William, Nicholas's loyal beta, the man who had stood by his side for 5 years. "William?" Nicholas breathed, shock rendering him momentarily motionless. "The king's mind has been poisoned by this witch and the traitor Caspian," William roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He signaled to a dozen armored guards stationed around the perimeter. "They are assassins! Kill them all to protect the crown!" "Hold your ground!" Nicholas bellowed, but it was too late. William's loyalists, men embedded deeply within the king's guard, drew their weapons and charged down the center aisle. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. William had access to the king's royal seal. William handled the military dispatches. William had always despised Eleanor, claiming her human sympathies made the Iron Fang pack look weak. "It was you," Nicholas snarled, his fangs elongating as his beast took full control. "You forged the orders. You hired the feral packs. You were meant to be the greatest conqueror in history, Nicholas," William shouted back, abandoning his crossbow and drawing a massive two-handed broadsword. "She made you soft. She made you beg for treaties instead of territory. I freed you from her." A guttural roar ripped from Nicholas's throat, a sound so terrifyingly feral that half of William's men froze in their tracks. Beside him, Caspian stepped forward, flipping his hunting knife in his hand. He looked at Nicholas, the hatred between them momentarily eclipsed by a shared, desperate need to protect the woman and the child behind them. "Keep them alive," Nicholas ordered his former best friend, not looking away from the charging soldiers. "Always," Caspian replied grimly. The battle was brief, bloody, and merciless. Nicholas did not fight like a king. He fought like a demon unchained from hell. He moved with a speed that defied his heavy armor. His broadsword, a blur of silver death. He shattered shields, sundered armor, and tore through William's loyalists with a terrifying, calculated savagery. He was unleashing 5 years of agonizing grief, 5 years of nightmares, and 5 years of mourning onto the men who had orchestrated his misery. Caspian fought a defensive perimeter around Eleanor and Leo, his movements sharp and tactical. A rogue knight lunged at Eleanor with a spear. Caspian parried the thrust and buried his knife in the man's throat, kicking him backward. Across the cathedral floor, Nicholas carved a path directly to his beta. William swung his heavy claymore in a massive arc, aiming for Nicholas's neck. The Alpha King didn't even bother to dodge. He caught the flat of William's blade with his bare, heavily scarred left hand. The steel sliced into his palm, but Nicholas didn't flinch, his golden eyes locked onto William's terrified human ones. "You took my family," Nicholas whispered, the demonic resonance of his voice vibrating through the floorboards. With a brutal twist, Nicholas snapped the claymore in half, burying his own broadsword deep into William's chest. The traitor gasped, blood bubbling at his lips as he dropped to his knees. "I bought the poisons from Thomas Blood himself," William choked out, coughing a spray of crimson, referencing the notorious black market dealer of the underground human syndicates. a detail that confirmed everything Caspian had ever suspected. I paid the feral alphas with your gold. I made you a god, Nicholas. You made me a monster, Nicholas replied coldly, ripping the blade free. William collapsed onto the stone, lifeless. The remaining traitorous guards dropped their weapons, falling to their knees in absolute surrender as the Alpha King stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, his armor painted in the blood of his enemies. The cathedral was eerily silent once more, save for the crackle of the altar candles and the soft whimpering of the young boy. Nicholas dropped his sword. It clattered loudly. He didn't care about the terrified Duke Geoffrey, or the crying bride, or the Archbishop hiding behind the pulpit. He turned slowly, facing the dark alcove where Caspian stood guarding Eleanor and the child. The Alpha King dropped to his knees. He didn't care about his pride. He didn't care that the entire nobility was watching. He kneeled on the blood-stained stone, bowing his head toward the woman he had loved since they were children. I didn't write the letters, Jen, Nicholas whispered, a solitary tear cutting a clean path down his dirt and blood-smeared cheek. I swear to you on my soul, on my wolf, and on the goddess above, I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped loving you. Eleanor slowly lowered her arms. She looked at William's body, then at the tears falling from her fierce, impenetrable king's eyes. The invisible tether of the mate bond, suppressed by fear and trauma for half a decade, suddenly snapped violently back into place, flooding her chest with the undeniable, agonizing truth of his innocence. She let out a broken sob, her knees buckling. Nicholas caught her before she hit the floor. He wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her against his chest, burying his face in her neck, inhaling the scent of winter pine and crushed midnight roses. She clung to his armor, her fingers digging into his shoulders, weeping uncontrollably as 5 years of terror washed away in the safety of his embrace. Caspian stood nearby, watching them. His jaw was tight, his chest aching with a complex, hollow pain. He had loved her. He had loved being a father to the boy, but he knew, seeing the golden light of the mate bond actively shimmering around them, that this was where she belonged. Nicholas slowly pulled back from Eleanor and looked up at Caspian. The Alpha King stood. He walked toward his former beta, stopping mere inches away. Caspian braced himself, knowing the punishment for running away with a royal mate was death, regardless of the circumstances. Instead, Nicholas reached out and grasped Caspian's forearm in a warrior's hold. "You protected my queen," Nicholas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You raised my son when I was made to be a villain. You gave up your life for them. I do not owe you my blade, Caspian. I owe you my kingdom." Caspian's eyes widened, the tight knot of anxiety in his chest unraveling. He gripped Nicholas's arm back, a shaky breath escaping his lips. "He's a good boy, Nicholas. He has your stubbornness." Nicholas swallowed hard. He looked down. Leo was peeking out from behind Caspian's leg, his ice-blue eyes staring up at the giant, blood-covered king. Nicholas knelt again, making himself as small as possible. He took off his metal gauntlet, revealing a large, scarred hand, and held it out gently. "Hello, Leo," Nicholas said softly, his voice cracking. The boy looked at his mother. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her smiling face. Hesitantly, the 4-year-old took a step forward. He reached out with a tiny hand and placed it against Nicholas's rough, bearded cheek. "Are you the king?" Leo whispered. Nicholas closed his eyes, leaning into the tiny, warm touch of his flesh and blood. "No, little one," he murmured, pulling the boy into a gentle, desperate hug. "I am your father." Did this medieval werewolf drama shatter your heart and piece it back together? If you loved the agonizing twists, the fierce loyalty of Caspian, and Nicholas's desperate fight to reclaim his family, hit that like button right now. Share this story with your fellow romance lovers, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another epic, heart-pounding werewolf romance on our channel. Tell us in the comments, who was the true hero?